So Greg, welcome to the remote meeting on April 16th of the 2229 Main Street Advisory Task Force. I am the chair, Paul Bohm. First thing I'll do is I'll call the roll, starting on the screen, my screen. David Ropeik.
Here.
Court Booth.
Here.
Carl Seidman.
Here.
Pam Hill.
Here.
Carrie Flood.
Here.
Gary Kleiman. Were you on mute, Gary? Or were you just quiet?
So. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, the volume was pretty low. We heard you. Kurt Herman.
Here.
And Rich Feely. I see Rich is connected. I don't see him live here. So Rich, can you hear us? Okay, I assume Rich is going to be joining us, but just to be, let's take some caution. Carrie, can you take some notes, some minutes here until Rich joins us? Or you could decline. You're on mute, Carrie.
Yes, I can try taking some notes, but I will
Okay.
tell you that right now I don't even have the meeting packet in front of me. I did find the agenda and I did read the meeting packet, but I can't get back to it at the moment. And I'm
Okay, well, we'll go through that. We'll go through that in a
Yeah.
minute. And in fact, let me do that right now because
Rich is listed as muted, by the way, Paul. I don't know whether you want to.
he's muted, but he's also off screen. Rich, we can't hear you or see you. Sounds like Tommy. Okay. We'll see what transpires. So I'm sharing my screen now. Yeah, so here's the agenda for today. Let me just go over that pretty briefly. We have two sets of minutes to approve. That was in the meeting packet. And I can show those on screen if people would like to review those. Then we have a couple of work stream updates. In particular, one major agenda item is the based on the PowerPoint information that Carl and Carrie put together on the economics, some of the cost issues, which we've been talking about for a couple of weeks. He's made some great progress. And then there's been some confusion on dates of meetings and what's happening the next couple of months. And I want to kind of end on that and then have public comment. I will just reiterate that those of you who are not on the task force, please stay muted and off camera, and during public comment, we'll take any comments that you have. So let me start out by the approval of minutes. We have two sets of minutes, which are from March 12th and March 26th. Hopefully you've had a chance to review those minutes. Anybody like me to scroll through them, or are we ready to have motions to approve them one at a time?
Paul, I'm here. Carrie's off the hook.
Great.
Oh, wonderful.
I knew you'd come through, Rich.
Thank you.
So let me stop sharing does anybody want to review these minutes as we talk about them? Okay, if not, let me stop sharing here. So do I have a motion on the March 12th minutes?
I'll move approval. This is Carl.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
This is sleepy task force tonight. Okay, let me go around and do a roll call for approval. David Ropeik, this is March 12th minutes.
In favor. Bro, yes, aye.
Court?
Not present, abstain.
Carl?
Aye.
Kurt?
Approve.
Gary?
I suppose I'll abstain as well. I was not there.
Okay, Carrie,
Abstain as not present.
Pam,
Approve.
Rich.
I believe I wasn't present either.
We had a slim quorum and I was there and I approve as well. So with that, the March 12th minutes are approved. March 26th minutes, which I think there are more of you were there.
I'll move
Any
approval of
comments?
those.
Edits? Excuse me?
I said I would move approval of those.
Okay, any comments before we move on that? Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Second,
Okay, let's have a vote. David,
Aye.
Court,
Abstain.
Carl,
Aye.
Pam,
Abstain, I was absent.
Carrie,
In favor, yes.
Gary,
Abstain.
Kurt,
Abstain as well.
Rich,
aye,
and I was there, although I approve, so the March 26 minutes are approved without any modifications. Thank you, Kurt, for March 12th and Rich for March 26th for taking those. Okay, so let's move into the main meeting. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Carl and Carrie in a minute. And I do have the PowerPoint, which I can go through. Probably easier for me to do that, Carl, than me to flip it over to you. But just a little before we get into that, just a little background. Can you refresh us sort of the process by which you collected the information, and then I'll share my screen.
Sure. I mean, it is in the slide deck, but I'll go through it.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
Well,
I
let me do
mean,
that.
but essentially, the committee, Carrie, myself, and Pam kind of worked through the sort of understanding of the potential costs that the town might incur if it acquired the site, what some of the categories were. We then developed a set of questions for specifically for town staff and town departments that related to those trying to better understand the costs. Through Megan's efforts, we held a meeting with town departments in December to kind of go explain, the work stream we're working on and go through some of the questions and talk about a process for getting estimates. Out of that meeting, the notion of having some scenarios that had more information about potential uses and level of development for town departments to use to make some of these estimates. So as a result of that, Carrie and I worked with Rich and Gary to come up with 3 illustrative scenarios that I think they presented to the committee before. So Megan sent those scenarios out to the town departments, I think in late January, if I remember correctly, with a little bit of an introductory email I produced. And then basically I followed up. I had to sort of follow up to clarify the information we were looking for with the departments. And I'd say only the police department actually wrote up their own sort of separate analysis. And then I had series of interviews with the assistant fire chief, with DPW, the CPW staff. I had a meeting with the light plant and they provided me some information. I also spoke to a developer that Rich referred me to, and an engineering firm. So I collected a lot of different data from these different sources and then sort of applied them, to the scenarios, and I'll walk through that. It's in sort of the slide deck. So that's kind of the process.
Yeah.
There was a first draft of the slide deck that Carrie and Pam reviewed and had some excellent comments on. And then I did get some comments from Chris and Megan that are incorporated as well. So that's got us to where we are now.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Let me just a couple of comments. I was interested in the Finance Committee report, FinCom report. I don't know how many of you have seen that. In the introduction, Parashar referred to 2229 Main Street pretty prominently in there, not with any detail, but basically saying that the possible acquisition and the costs related to that are a major uncertainty, and at least the readers of the document that the town need to be cognizant of those costs as they are developed, as our process proceeds. Related to that, I also I sent Parashar an email inviting FinCom to participate in these task force meetings, which I think in the past he had said that there would be a representative. I think going forward, I think it's going to be important for FinCom to be plugged into these cost estimates, and it might even be useful, Carl, to have a separate discussion with them, or maybe
I'd be
present.
happy to meet with them and talk through
Yeah,
what
Be-
I've done, yeah.
Because it's-
Parashar is going off the Finance Committee.
right.
So
It's turning over.
They'll
So
be
we have-
sort of restructuring after town meeting.
Right, and the reason why I mentioned that, there may be things that are missing, things in here that need more explanation from a FinCom point of view. I mean, whatever goes into our report really should have the information that FinCom would find useful when they review it. Okay, so that's all. The only reason I'm bringing that up. So
You're saying, Paul, but I think as a matter of process, it's important for us as a whole committee to get through this integration process first. Because, as we'll go through this, I think the way we present this will have implications. And so it shouldn't just be, what Carl is doing on operations. It should be informed by what the risk assessment has to say, by what the reuse scenarios turn out to be, by what the legal acquisition. That's when I feel like we need to do, full court press, doing outreach with a lot of groups.
yeah, no, I agree. And just, I mean, at this point, it's preliminary, so the types of information in here, Gary, should match with the types of information that would be expected from a financial point of view. I'm not saying anything's missing, but yeah, I mean, there are details and final presentations to be worked out. But anyway, let's put that aside. I was just I was triggered by the mention in the FinCom report of this site, and MCI Concord was mentioned as well. So with that, let me move this forward. Okay, Carl, let me know when you want to change.
Yeah, so this is just, what are the costs? What's kind of the overview? And I think we all kind of know this, the site isn't really in usable form now. It's going to require significant infrastructure investment before it could actually be used. How much of those costs the town has to incur versus private development, are going to depend on the future uses and other aspects of the plan. The town will face new operating costs to maintain any of the site infrastructure of its own. And then there'll be some impact on town services. And I really just looked into fire and police, but there could be school impacts potentially with residential development. And also, there's a revenue side of this, which we haven't analyzed at all. There could be tax revenues. Of course, those won't come, the infrastructure costs have to come up front. The tax revenues, will be deferred by several years. And then, there may also be fee revenue. And I just want to emphasize, these numbers are very rough and very preliminary. And I think have to be, taken with the understanding that we don't really know what the new uses are going to be. There's no infrastructure design or even really a site plan at this point. There's been no engineering work to sort of determine, what's needed, what could be accommodated. So it's these are really just to give you the town a rough sense of the order of magnitude, the type of cost, the order of magnitude of cost, and how they vary with different scenarios. The numbers themselves are really placeholders in some sense.
Right,
Hey,
I'd add there, that these are in basically today's dollars,
Right,
and it won't actually happen for some time yet.
right. That's
I mean,
a-
it helps people understand in the current context,
Right.
but the other thing would be that a lot of the upfront cost would be um, paid over years, borrowing. So if there is new revenue, it
Right.
would help to support it. If the choices for use are not revenue producing or expense saving, then those expenses are something we have to swallow on our own.
Yeah.
Yep.
Carl, do you want to take comments as we go along? Or you want to wait till the end?
Well, either way, I'm happy to take comments as we go along.
Well, one comment is, and this is obvious to us and anybody who reviews this recording. So this is part of the cost situation. The acquisition costs are not part
Right.
of this analysis.
Right.
Obviously, so these are sort of operational costs. This is if and when the town actually
Right,
owns the site. And the question on the last bullet, cost figures are rough and preliminary, true, and they won't be fully known until way down the road, but can they be revised and between now and when we make recommendations, or do you think this is sort of?
I don't think it's worth. I mean, they might get refined a little bit, but the big things like, the site engineering, what the final infrastructure design is, that we're not going to know. So, it's trying to spend a lot of time
Right.
to get more precise, to try and be more precise around something that is not at all precise. Is
I would just replace the last two bullets by what is included and what is not included. And then people
Well,
will.
let me keep going, because I think the slides kind of explain what the data is, so the reader can kind of interpret it. So I think I've discussed all of this, I mean, that these were informed by reuse scenarios. I'd say, as we already heard, strong development interest in housing. That's why there are housing options in here. Developers didn't really see the site being feasible for office commercial use, so that's not in here. And then the town needs, which are listed here in the different scenarios, really came out of some town documents and some, conversations and meetings that Rich and Gary had with various town departments and committees. And once again, these are preliminary. The ultimate reuse
Right.
scenarios might be different. So the next slide, Gary. So these are the three scenarios. I think people are all familiar with them. I don't know if anyone has questions on them.
Well, not quite. We had a discussion a little earlier today, because there's another developer that we were trying to query here. That when this is written up, there may be sort of various permutations of some of these scenarios. 2A and B and 3A and B, and I mean it's all here, but I use the example, the scenario of just recreation. It can be pulled out of here, but it's not a explicit scenario. But we want to make sure that kind of information that we're not just limited to these three. That there could be various.
I mean, yeah.
Versions of these, right?
I think, the way to look at these scenarios, at least for this purpose, were to try and look at how different types of costs and scales of costs are going to vary. With different, so you basically have all private development, you have a mix of private,
Right.
that should say public, I'm sorry, that's the private and town use, and then all town use. And I think in some ways that has a bigger impact. The town acquisition and full use for recreation or versus offices and the CPW facilities, I don't know, it might affect the septic somewhat, but I don't know that it's going to change the magnitude of the cost that much.
No, I don't think it involves, it really is going to affect how we describe this later on in the report. I'll just put that aside. Rich and Gary and I chatted about this a little
Yeah.
earlier, and I think we're on the same page here. Okay, next slide, yeah.
Question?
Yep.
Carl, for scenario number one, would this in fact, as it's written here, be a town acquisition and then a partial resale?
It's a developer acquisition and developer ownership of the site. And then there would be a easement or lease arrangement in which the town would be able to use part of the property for this town storage, a dog park, a bus stop.
Got it.
There's
Okay.
no town acquisition of the series. So, and you'll see there, the implication there is the town doesn't own the site, it's not paying for the infrastructure, it's not maintaining the infrastructure.
I just wanted to be doubly clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is basic. Scenarios 2 and 3 are town acquisition scenarios. Scenario 1 is like if the town chooses not to acquire it and the developer acquires it.
Right.
So it's really, it's a reuse scenario, yes, but it's a non-acquisition reuse
Right.
scenario, yeah.
And reserves the right for those limited types of town uses.
Right, it has that assumption that that could be negotiated at some point, that's,
And,
yeah.
and I should say, you know, there may be some lease cost or, you know, once again, the sort of acquisition and use of the site per se isn't in this analysis, so the town might have to pay the developer something, you know, for the right to have those uses.
Right, but the town doesn't have any right to use it, it's basically, it's a private piece of property, right?
Yep.
Okay. Okay,
So this is where the data has come from. So, you know, I basically have I've gotten figures from different sources. So I was referred to a developer who was recently built, you know, it was in the process of building a new residential subdivision in Carlisle. He had to put in all the new infrastructure. So it's kind of a complete, in some ways, it's somewhat comparable. Obviously, the site characteristics are different. But all new infrastructure had to be installed. So he shared with me the cost for that. Then DPW gave me their cost figures for what it would cost to put in road, sidewalk, drainage, and water distribution. Now, this isn't based on their direct experience. They haven't built something like this recently. So they gave me estimates they got from speaking to engineering firms. And then the light plant actually gave very detailed figures for the scenarios that included, like, you know, the cost for the battery storage, the cost for transformers to serve the buildings, the cost for solar fields. And I took that stuff out and I just took their figures for actually, you know, putting in the conduits and the equipment. So, you know, and I did include what I consider site infrastructure lighting for the parks and charging stations for the parking, but the sort of cost they gave us for the actual town facilities, I didn't put in. And then I spoke to one engineering firm to get their estimates, which were pretty much just for the road, you know, road, sidewalk, drainage. And then most of these costs are on a per linear foot basis. So I basically, you know, I said, well, you know, how much infrastructure do we need? I went to the master plan concept in the 2021 report. There's a ring road there. So I've kind of assumed that would get built and that we'd have infrastructure throughout that entire road. I went to the town's GPS site and they have a little measuring tool and I tried to estimate the road length. So it came out at 2,300. So, you know, once again, this is very rough. The actual road and the sort of distribution infrastructure might be different. And the linear road even if we do a linear road, the actual measurements might be different. But this is sort of the process I had to go through to be able to translate these per linear feet estimates into numbers. So go to the next slide, Paul, and you'll see how this continues. So here are the figures I got. From the Carlisle project, 2,250 per linear feet. That includes everything, including septic. These are DPW figures for a 2-lane road with sidewalks and storm drainage, and then 379 for a water main. Engineering firm I spoke to said 700 to 1,100, fairly similar for 2-lane road, sidewalk, storm drainage. Although he said, if you're going to put the DPW, CPW facilities there, you're going to be bringing heavy trucks back and forth on the road. You're going to need, you know, higher quality asphalt. You're going to need more gravel. Your road's going to cost you more. So there could easily be a 50% premium for that. And then the light plant came to $210 per linear feet for the conduit, installation, and equipment. $500,000 for lighting for the playing fields, and then depending on what type of chargers you put in, 50 to 200,000 for 2 EV chargers at the bus stop. There have been existing conduits installed up to where the pumping, you know, shed building is. That I got a map from CMLP and measured that as 550 linear feet. So I deducted that from the conduit cost, and that was a savings of about $115,000 that, you know, we were able to pass on to the you know, the responsible parties there. So, you know, and there might be some additional savings to these costs depending on what type of town guidance on the site work we're able to come up with, you know, prior to this. So I think the next slides, I go to the operating costs as figures and then apply these to the scenarios.
So just before you leave, that last bullet on site work, is additional grading and site work something that should be estimated? I mean, obviously, we don't know
Right.
exactly what's going to go where, but is there some estimate of what site work is?
And I don't, you know, no one has broken down these figures for me. Between, you know, all the actual components. I mean, you could, you know, and I think it would be hard to get a contractor to do that without, you know, knowing a lot more about the site and the plan. You know, there is, so anyway, so when you apply these to the estimated road length, west where the electric conduits are in, you know, the Carlisle figures, you get 5 million for the cost. If you take the DPW and white plan figures, you're at, you know, 2.9 to 3.8 million, but without a septic system. So, you know, that's certainly going to add some additional cost. So, you know, I think it's reasonable to think that the infrastructure costs are somewhere in this $4 to $5 million range in today's dollars. I should say I took a look at the budget for the Forest Ridge multifamily development. And they haven't built it yet. These are just projections. And their site costs are a little less than 4 million. I think it's 3.8, 3.9 million. That's less road. I think they're using an existing septic system. So that's a, you know, another data point. I am waiting. The developer of the reuse of the Papa Razi site said he might have contractor estimates at the end of April. So we might get another data point from him. So, but this, you know, 4 or 5 million seems like a, you know, ballpark figure that's reasonable.
The Forest Ridge data point, there is a new septic system being put in there. I don't know where they're expanding the existing system, and also at least the initial application has a tremendous amount of soil removal.
Right.
And
Okay. Yeah. So that might overestimate what we're really going to need to do here. So, yep. Well, I didn't put it in here because I didn't really know very much. I just had the number. I didn't know much about it. So, yeah. So if you go to the next slide, the annual town service costs. So the police, you know, sent a pretty detailed memo with some data on, you know, activity for the Muse project, but they basically came to the conclusion that yes, there will be some additional overtime, service calls, investigations for the residential uses, but they don't really think there are costs that they could associate just to this site. There would be, cost increases that would be part of ongoing population growth in West Concord. The fire department felt that, adding this here once again, in conjunction with the other multifamily developments that are planned for West Concord, would require it to add, 4 positions, which they estimate at 470,000 per year, and a new ambulance. They felt the assisted living project alone could generate this, because there are a lot of calls and responses they have for those type of facilities. So I've kind of added all of these costs in, but it's really not, I don't know that they're uniquely to the residential development here. The minimal maintenance costs for the new electric and water infrastructure, since that's new, and some of that comes with warranties. And then I took the average annual road maintenance cost that the town gave me of $909.50 a linear foot, and you just applied it to the 2,300 linear feet. So I think the next few slides
Yeah,
cover
so-
this
so,
scenario, but-
Carl, how would, if it turns out that, I don't know which scenario would be, 2B or 3B, if it turns out that there were just playing fields and solar and battery and no residences, or would a lot of these costs go away?
Well, I mean, I imagine there'll be less, but you still need to get electric service to the fields for lights.
Well, I'm actually talking about the police and fire department.
The police and fire, yeah, no, those would go away. The police,
Right.
yeah, and in fact, you'll see, even under the town, they go away under scenario 3, because the fire department doesn't really see any incremental costs, even, with the town offices and public works. So, yeah.
And so the police and fire costs, even if it were a private acquisition, private development, the town would incur those costs, even with private acquisition, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so that's an important point.
Yeah.
Okay,
So if you go to the next slide, I think, so these are the scenarios, here it's privately owned, the infrastructure costs are gonna be borne by the private developer. And then the service costs here are really just for the fire department staff. Now, there could be additional school costs. I didn't try to estimate that, because I mean, it's gonna depend on how many school children, and it's gonna depend on, this will get built and occupied, I don't, 7, 8, 9 years from now. And I don't, what the school enrollment will look like then, and whether this would stretch capacity or not, what the age of the children would be. It's not a simple issue, but there could be additional school costs.
Right, but I think this is where, like, when we get through to these scenarios or alternative scenarios, I think it's important that on the slide, we at least acknowledge the costs and the benefits that we don't know, like you did.
Well, yeah,
Newtown tax revenue from multifamily housing, we don't know.
right. Yeah, but I mean,
Good
this
to
is,
acknowledge it.
this is just qualitative. I mean, we could estimate, we
No.
could look at the assessment of other multifamily projects and make an estimate. That wouldn't be too hard. The school costs, I think, are a little more challenging to.
Yeah, I'm not saying that we try to estimate things that are difficult to estimate. I'm just saying, like you did with the last bullet, I think we should recognize that there may be school impacts.
Right.
And
Yeah.
just say, unquantified,
Right.
tax revenue and school costs.
Yeah, I think we do know how many kids live at Prescott that are in the school system. They can give you that number. So if they do 200, 250 units, you're looking at a similar number of kids. We also know that the construction costs, and therefore presumably the initial value of a project the size of Thoreau, whatever they're calling the thing at the Thoreau Club, or Novo is around $100 million.
Well, yeah, except the assessed value is typically an income, is it based on an income model, not construction costs if it's a revenue generating.
Well, yeah, but in other words, their income has got to be sufficient to pay $100 million in capital investment. So, I mean, if we need it, and I'm not sure we do,
Yeah.
I think we could come up with some idea of what it would do to the tax base.
Yeah, no, what I would suggest doing is look at some multifamily projects.
Yeah, look at
what assessed value is, per unit or per, square foot, and, apply that and use that as an estimate, something like that.
Yeah, well, you can
You
look
know-
at whatever the Prescott's valued at.
We're getting this sort of the deeply into the
Right.
if the town doesn't acquire option.
Right.
I think the select board asked us way back, tell us what the scenario is if the town doesn't acquire it. And I think it's a completely different scenario, and we have to kind of portray that completely different than if the town acquires it. I mean, both those have to be in the report, but they're different. This is sort of in the quote unquote chapter if the town doesn't acquire it versus the chapter if the town acquires it. So
But we need to analyze both, to your point. So that's why
Well,
this scenario is in there.
no, we have to analyze both, but I don't want to intertwine those in our communications. We'll
Yeah.
talk about that. We'll talk about it later, but this is extraordinarily useful work, Carl and Carrie. It's really it's above
Carl.
and beyond. It's rough and preliminary, but you covered a lot of interesting bases here.
Rich, do you have a question? Comment?
Yeah, some on the fire. I mean, my first question is, if they need another ambulance, do we have to expand a firehouse? The second question is, this, I would assume, is thinking that that both 40Bs are going to be built
Right,
and that this is incremental to that. So
Right.
it's,
yeah,
assisted living generates more ambulance calls than a normal residence. But, what are we looking at? 2 or 3 a day here, probably? Maybe. They got to have those numbers because we've got other ones. So I'm really wondering whether one is saddling this with,
Yeah.
essentially another fire, what amounts to another fire company.
Right.
And also whether, I understand the problems in rush hour getting across Route 2, but what about, running an ambulance that only runs from 7 to 7 or something like that? I don't know.
well,
But-
yeah, I mean, I kind of took what the fire department told me on face value, and, obviously it's gonna get more scrutiny. And this is a problem you face in a lot of this type of fiscal impact analysis, is like, do you think about this purely from a marginal cost perspective? Because, if only one of if this only gets built and the other projects don't, then do you actually have that impact? Or do you, attribute it all? Is this going to build that last and is going to be the one that pushes it over? Or do you use more of an average cost perspective? So I don't know. I kind of took it as face value. It might be worth qualifying this a little more.
It's a question of how deeply we go into the non-acquisition analysis. When I'm looking at this, it strikes me that the financial impact on the town may be greater if they don't acquire it. I'm not, it's probably off the top of my head. There's a lot on here, and a lot that we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
There's a non-acquisition scenario, schools and fire and et cetera. Plus, I don't want to get too far off track, but I would venture to say, Rich, that if the two 40B projects are approved, the likelihood of putting another 250 unit and get that approved by the town would be very slim. On density issues, but, you know, we can debate that later.
Yeah, no, I hear you, but I think there's no guarantee that particularly the second one's gonna get built. But the
no,
fact is the demand
that's
for
true.
housing is still there. So I don't want to subordinate the non-acquisition. I mean, I think we need to look at both of them. But you know, you do get tax revenue. Yes, you've got kids. They would have to build the septic system. Whereas if the town uses it even just for fields, and particularly if it uses it for more extensive recreation, then the town's incurring that
That
whole
wouldn't-
septic cost.
I don't come to the conclusion that this scenario is more costly for the town. I would not land at that place, because, you know, there is gonna be tax revenue here, and there's gonna be infrastructure costs, you know, under the other scenarios, so.
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing with you,
Yeah.
Carl.
Yeah, and, you know, I'm not advocating
But
that.
Guys,
we should-
that's assuming that the tax revenue from whatever housing were be built there would cover the marginal cost of town services and education.
Right, yeah.
And, you know, plus the debt for any upfront costs that we do end up putting into it. And I think that's very hard to project.
Right.
But you know there's going to be an impact there. And I mean, you can look at what an average household pays in taxes relative to the typical cost of running town government and schools and town services, and know that the average smaller you know, apartment kind of house is not going to be covering a lot of that cost with their tax.
You know, I want to make sure that the task force stays in our swim lane here, and I think we have to look at the non-acquisition scenario and talk about these costs. But to the extent, you know, we're not going to do a full financial analysis. You know, I think that there could be revenue generation to offset costs, yes.
Yeah,
But,
no, I agree with you there, Paul, yeah.
I think, you know, we probably should stay at the 5,000 foot level, 10,000, as, yeah, because we're not going to get any more detail than that, and.
There's gonna be more work done on these issues as the town, you know, moves further down the path, so they're gonna, you know, should the select board, FinCom and others want to dig more deeply into this, then they could commission more work around.
Yeah, I mean, look, just, I don't want to subordinate this, Rich, to the others, but it is it's a different. We are charged with, you know, should the select board move towards acquisition, and if they don't, what, you know, what happens then? I think we have to deal with both of those, and so, yeah, I think we have to have all these in there. Okay.
If
Next.
I'm on the select board and I'm considering whether to acquire or not, one of the things that I'm thinking about is, if I don't, does it cost the town money or make the town money net? Net. And to that question, which I think is a basic question, I would suggest that we try as best we can. Let me back up and say, Carl and Carrie, amazing work. Oh my God, a lot of work. Thank you.
Carl,
To the extent that we can, having some numbers on what the potential revenue sources would be, so that that's in the picture as the town is weighing either or. Very preliminary, of course, would be helpful to the select board's decision. Having some revenue figures that are very rough.
Yeah, so, but let me just say something about timing here. So at the end of this year, nobody's going to acquire anything. At the end of this year, it's going to start the next phase of this process, which is going to be even before the town actually moves to acquire or decides not to. It's going to depend on a lot of different things, which includes fleshing out a lot of these issues, right? So we are not going to come up with a great, and we've got to deal with revenue generation as an issue. But that's going to need to be analyzed in the next committee, by the next phase, as part of a planning phase. And it's a very important thing to do, David, but we're not going to do that.
Well, we're doing it with cost.
Yeah, why wouldn't we do with revenue what we were doing with costs?
We're doing it with costs. I fail to see why we do it with one side of that equation and not the other.
Well, I
Well,
don't know that, I think it has to do with the charge.
yeah, we got to look back at our charge, and the
I don't-
charge is, would acquiring the site be a good business decision, right? So we haven't-
Exactly.
Right.
So
And-
to understand a good business decision, you have to look at costs and benefits.
Of both choices.
Yeah.
To the extent that we can, I'm just saying.
Yeah, that's all.
There's a limit how deeply we can get into estimating revenues, and
Agree. 10,000-foot level of revenues,
Well,
10,000-foot levels of cost.
Right.
I mean,
Sure.
we could, on this scenario, we could, I think what we could do without too much difficulty would be look at the assessments and tax revenue for comparable, projects and note that, and include that. That would not be hard to do, and we can do that.
And compared to the annual added cost as this gets going, if it is a private development.
Just, if, I don't know, if just to pick a number out of the air, if the average tax bill on an apartment in this project is $4,000, and I don't know that it is, but if it is, that's $1 million in annual tax revenue. So that's, you're at break even roughly, probably a little above break even, because the fire costs here are probably more than you attribute to this. So that kind of gives you some sense, although, it's going to depend a lot on what the school impacts are.
okay. Well, but
And we're
just,
being
yeah,
very unfair to Carl. I think we should let him go on to scenario 2 and scenario 3, but the same comment's going to come back. I think we can estimate the revenue of an assisted living facility at a very 10,000-foot level, and we can estimate the revenue of,
Right.
DPW building and so forth.
The one thing with the assisted living, we'd have to decide whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit, and what's the revenue generating portion of the nonprofit. So it's a little
Right.
more complex. But anyway, let's move.
yeah, my last comment on this, we're gonna have to think as a task force long and hard, whether we want to, in scenario 1, have explicitly a 250 unit apartment unit on record, given everything else going on in town with density and in this part of West Concord as well. So we're not gonna think long and hard right now, but before we put this forward, we're gonna have to think about that.
Can I just observe, I'm very impressed by how much you rolled up your sleeves here. There's a joke about an economist and a priest and somebody stuck on a
Desert Island.
desert island, and the punchline kind of is, the economist says, assume you have a can opener.
Right.
And my point here is that, there twofold. One is, this is extremely speculative. And I really love Carl's admonition that we, very clearly state how preliminary, how rough it is. And the other is the problem that certainly in my world, environmental cost benefit, you can really over promise precision by getting too granular when you have no business being as granular as you're being, and people begin to get sort of start thinking that, well, we have a lot of numbers now and we kind of know stuff when we really don't. So I guess my point is, this is highly speculative. Be wary of giving people the impression we know more than we do, but kudos to Carl and others for giving us a very, very basic frame, which should have two parts to it. It should have costs and revenue. There's no question about that.
Pam, you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that the reason we came up with that 250 unit or whatever for scenario 1 was basically because we were told by the reuse committee, who had spoken to developers, that what they would do with this site if they got it the thing that made money for them would be to do one of these big, many person buildings. That's what they do these days. So that it wasn't just we took a wild guess. It was well, this is the only thing anybody told us they might actually be willing to buy something this big and take that kind of a financial risk.
Okay, no,
Yeah.
understood.
And-
That's fair. Absolutely, yeah.
And that's the benefit to them, not to the town of Concord. You know, they want to make money off of that construction project and the sales of the units that are included. They're less concerned about the ongoing cost to the town of Concord.
And yes, and the impact, exactly. Okay, scenario 2,
So here, you'd have those $4 or $5 million in infrastructure costs here. Now, the town might be able to recoup a substantial portion of that from the assisting living developer, either, through a land lease or a sale, perhaps a direct cost share in the construction of the infrastructure, or they could, set up betterment fees. Although the one caveat here we don't know about is what type of revenue sharing agreement are we going to have with state and federal agencies, and how that might affect what we recoup from, the developer of the assisted living, how much of that would go to the town and how much of that would go to the, profit sharing per se. Obviously, that's going to depend a lot on the terms of any disposition. You have the annual service costs here for road maintenance. I'm assuming it's a public road, and for the fire department staff. And then you have capital costs here for the charging stations, for a new ambulance, and for the lighting for the playing fields. And I assume there'd be some tax revenue from the assisted living project, because it's a revenue generating project. Even if it's owned by a nonprofit, not unusual for for revenue generating projects to pay some taxes. So, but how that would happen and how that would get assessed, that's require more due diligence with the assessors.
I really like how you break it down here. What strikes me is that the first 2 bullets are kind of independent of exactly what's developed on the site. And so whether those numbers are realistic or not, those are important numbers, regardless of what happens, whether it's playing fields or charging stations or whatever. The infrastructure cost to as a foundation for development are kind of captured in the first 2 bullets, I think. And so those are important. The other ones are even more speculative because it depends on what actually
Right.
is planned for the site. So I think it's good to think about those in those 2 buckets.
Carl, and the 4 to 5 million, I mean, the big infrastructure cost is going to be septic system or sewage. We know it was $1 million plus when Junction Village was proposed as assisted living.
Well,
Is that in the 4.4 to 5 million? With the idea-
it's in the 5 million in the sense that that's in the Carlisle project.
Okay,
The 3 to 4 million is, roads, sidewalks, water pipes, storm
Okay.
drainage, electric conduits, all of that type of stuff. So that's still, that even without the septic is more, is a 2 to 3 times the septic. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, I think it would be important to indicate that, maybe an additional bullet or something, because, I think that's a big question. Is the town going to have to build septic? Well, not for this.
Well,
If the operator builds it, that's all.
yeah. Well, I mean, there might be some small contribution to it, because I imagine there will be some town bathrooms if you're putting up,
Yeah, you put in,
but it'd be a small portion of it. Yeah.
yeah. So I just like to see that broken out so it can be talked about
Well,
separately.
the septic number is the most speculative, because we don't really,
Yeah.
Yeah.
we don't really know what that's going to look like, both from a site perspective and from a, use perspective. Yeah.
Well, it
Yeah.
just strikes me that those first 2 bullets, this may sound like an oxymoron, are a solid ballpark, right? Because you have some benchmarks of other developments, and so I think those feel like, notwithstanding, Pam, that they are, uncertain, speculative, but there's some veracity to the scale of those numbers, I think.
Maybe I'm splitting the baby here, but I think you're both right. I think the combination of any of these things is highly speculative, but I think that Carl has given us a pretty solid basis for what, the road costs, what the septic costs, what the, lighting costs, but will it be in that combination? Who knows? I think, we have framed, the reuse committee has framed this as, and this was a chapeau statement about all three scenarios, even though we haven't let poor Carl get through his 3-scenario presentation. I mean, these 3 scenarios from the reuse group were intended to span this space. The space is going to be occupied not by 3 determinative outcomes on this site. The space is going to be highly speculative, not just through the writing of our report, but for the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, we're not going to know what's going to go here. But I think that having a solid basis for estimating the, if you will, the menu of options of 10 or 20 elements of whether it's a, this kind of development or that kind of development will give the select board information that they need to estimate what kind of direction or what path they might want to take. So I think this is really helpful information, Carl, and I definitely agree with everybody who's giving you kudos for pulling this together, and Carrie, but how we put it together and present it to other committees, to the finance committee, to the select board, I think we still need to talk about as a committee, because there's a lot
let me just modify so if the select board were to say, look, we don't know what we're going to do on the site, but tell us, if we acquire the site, what's the basic to provide the infrastructure for whatever happens later. Give us a ballpark, and I'd say it looks like about 4 to 5 million on that, and then that sort of gives them and then you have the other pieces that are estimated here. If we decide through X, Y, and Z, but I think that detailed planning comes later. But part of the decision may be, if we acquire it, what's the base load cost to just get this site ready for development? And it looks like it's 4 to 5 million.
Yeah, and I think Rick has already poked holes in that, saying it's 2 to 3 million for the road. It's about $1 million or so for the septic. It's about, it depends on what goes there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
yeah,
I keep thinking it's kind of, you're talking about the ballpark. It's a ballpark with no wall around it. It'll change based on what happens
Right.
in the ballpark.
For example, I just say this, this is based on a sort of 23 linear foot ring road. I don't know at all that that's ultimately what you're going to do in terms of the infrastructure for the site. You might create a very different design, and that, there might be a smaller road to uses that the town has, and there might be a road off of that that's more private. I don't know. We don't. I think it's coming back to Pam's point. It's without really knowing what the site plan is, and how that's gonna relate to the uses. These are still very preliminary figures.
Yes, but look,
I
my
think-
point,
I think-
my broken record here is to say, that's true, we don't know what we're gonna do with the site, but it looks to me like, just if we acquire the site, to get the site ready for development, it's gonna be, I'll say 3 to 5 million, in that range. It's not gonna be 20
Yeah.
million, it's not gonna be 1 million. It's
Right.
probably gonna be 3 to,
Right.
and that's useful information.
Right.
I think, may I just say that that's where I might part company with you, Paul. I think I think this is excellent work, and I think that it's all in how we present it. And I think the caveats probably will be longer than the presentation, which is as it should be. The worst thing we could do is to say, forgive me, Paul, but in my judgment, something like, well, we think the ballpark is, which suggests a level of certainty, even speculatively, that I think goes beyond what we should do. I think what we should do is fashion a way of talking about this that pulls together what Gary's talking about, presents the kind of very careful cautioning that Carl is presenting, and think about that a lot before we deliver a sort of surface statement that may be relied upon inappropriately.
Well, I agree, but there's no certainty in the word ballpark, right? So when you say ballpark, that implies great uncertainty just by saying that. So,
Hey, one suggestion I have on that point is to include a qualitative evaluation of uncertainty and risk factors that could significantly impact both cost and revenue. There's things that we just won't be able to quantitatively estimate, but just to include qualitative discussion of those, which you may be planning on anyway, but that might
Yeah.
be up some of those issues. Things that could really, break the bank in terms of cost, or some of the assumptions that could drive the cost up or down.
well, remember, we're in no danger here of overplaying our certainty, because we're going to have a whole section of this report on uncertainty, right? So, yeah, whether it's qualitative or whether it's ballpark, Pam and we're going to be very transparent with the uncertainties in almost everything in this report, from legal, infrastructure, all through, right? We're going to do that. So, but this is a great starting point for advising us, like, we're, okay, tell us in general, is this $1 or is it $20 million? So that's what I'll say. Should we go to scenario 3?
Yep. So here, the town bears all the infrastructure costs because it's using the site for its own purposes. And once again, if it puts in the DPW facility, then the road costs may be higher, although it may save on the septic because it won't need as much septic for housing. So, maybe that balances out, maybe it doesn't. It will have that, it won't have the fire department costs, but some road maintenance costs, and then, has the same sort of capital costs for the lighting and the charging stations, but no new tax revenue here because it's all town use. But however, it will be giving up some facilities elsewhere in town, and there might be future revenue from reuse of that, depending if the town puts that into private use, then there might be revenue from that.
Exactly. That's important, that there may be other land that is sold off or put to profitable use. Yes, absolutely.
And then just the last slide here is just an attempt to put a comparative of these additional issues. Yeah, this is just more caveats. This is on the institutional controls. That every indication, I think, from the other community we've spoken to, and sort of our own sense of what the town will have to do, is these are fairly modest costs. We'll have to train staff, we'll have to incorporate, some information and oversight into permitting and inspection processes for construction and development. There'll be some coordination work with EPA, DPW, DeMaximus, as there's regular inspections of the site. There's no site acquisition costs under scenario 1, so that potentially large cost savings. There are these costs that I haven't tried to quantify for site reuse planning, master planning, zoning. Under scenario 1 and 2, you do still have to do some site planning and engineering for scenarios 2 and 3, but you're probably not going to have to do the master planning and the zoning because it's not going to be privately developed. And then we don't know yet what the cost for environmental liability insurance would be, which would, I guess Chris is working on getting an estimate there, and that would apply to scenarios 2 and 3. And then the last slide is a comparative table.
Yeah, I think you'd have to add to this, I guess, legal costs. If the town decides to proceed, there are legal costs with negotiations as well.
Yeah, so that second bullet could be legal and site acquisition costs. Yeah.
I think it's a great summary.
Hmm.
We could tweak this based on how we tweak the rest of the information.
I think I think significant figures is important. It's 4.85 different from 4.45. So,
Yeah, right.
Probably best not to go to more than two significant figures on any of this.
Yeah, so I could just round it to, I mean, obviously it's a little
Yeah.
weird to have some in thousands and some in millions, but
Yeah.
we could go, 5 to 6, 4.5 to 5.5 or something like that. Yeah.
I think it's great. My main comment would be, I think we should strive to estimate some of the revenue side too. Because I think this is fantastic and very informative.
Question for Carl and Carrie. Were there any town departments who expressed interest but to a lesser degree and thus aren't showing up here? Do we have other stakeholders who might have hoped to land in this scenario set?
You
We've
mean in
got
terms
rec,
of,
we have rec,
town use?
yeah, we have
Yeah.
rec, we have DPW.
Right, I defer to Rich and Gary on that.
and
Yeah, that would-
CMLP.
There
The
are
range-
basically scenarios on the reuse work stream, and we did reach out to, if you look at the next item in the packet, it's the summary of the reuse work stream interviews. And if you go on through the packet, you can see all of the people that we spoke to. And we tried to reach out to a very broad set of stakeholders to see who was interested. And these scenarios reflect basically where we saw the most interest.
Everything we heard that there was some town support for is dreamt of in at least one of these scenarios. Now, we didn't hear anything from schools because we were told not to talk to the schools, and also police and fire. But every other town function that I can think of, we talked to, and their concerns, rec, elder affairs, economic development, everybody else is here. The one thing I would say about economic development is they'd like non-residential tax base, but we didn't hear interest in that in the private sector. So that's the one thing that some people in town would like to see that isn't in one of these scenarios.
Okay, thank you. We were indeed explicit with the school committee that we didn't think they wanted outreach from this committee, and they confirmed that. And then back to the qualitative kind of caveats that we might put in here. I think we're going to state the obvious that we know there's a Peabody and a MCI, but again, that the select board need little reminding on that, I'm sure.
yeah, the moving pieces here, including those, but Carl mentioned, let's say you cite DPW here, well, then Kai's Road is up for grab. There's lots of moving parts here that, and we can only go so far into kind of talking about those. Let me mention one other. The reason why Gary and Rich and I talked earlier is one other classification of developer who they're going to talk to, and these are the recreational. I'll call it recreational complex developers. There's one way back when we were doing the reuse work. I approached an organization called Edge Sports. Edge Sports developed this big recreational complex in Wellesley with partnership with the town of Wellesley. They operate, their business model is to work in partnerships with municipalities. They want to make money, but but they're into partnerships and building recreational assets. So it's possible that they might be an interested developer, not necessarily to buy the site, but maybe to lease the site in some agreement with the town. So we're going to have some conversation with them. This may not be the best place for them to to locate such a facility, but they haven't told us go away. They said, yeah, let's hear more. So.
Paul,
that-
I'm
that-
curious on that one. What entity paid for the construction of facilities?
Ed Sports, they invested, they got the land for free.
It's the land, yeah, okay, all right.
They got,
yeah,
they got the land for free, and there was some agreement with the town on leasing, and so it was beneficial for them as an entry cost, but they did the construction. Did they do the infrastructure development? I have no idea. The town probably did the connection, so I
Mhm.
think, it's if a group like that's interested, then they start fact finding and negotiating, so it's,
Right. And nobody's reaching out to us about it at this point.
what do you mean?
I mean, the commercial, private developers, there has not been a significant interest in development of the property for commercial purposes, which is why we ended up with housing in that first bullet.
That's what the
Interesting.
developers told us.
Nobody's been reaching out to us for housing or anything else. We've been reaching out to private developers. And we have not yet reached out to this recreational developer, but we will. And so we'll see what they say about the prospects for recreational development. When we reached out to other private developers, they did express interest in housing and not commercial, but.
Right, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay, any other comments on this segment, Pam? Yeah, go ahead.
So I was going to say that my idea of a scenario where you had a group that came in that did something like a recreational facility was that it was more like scenario number 2, where we still own the place and they build their facility and run it and run programs we want run there. That they're doing stuff for the town, that's still functionally a town facility, but it's a way of not ending up paying as much for it. It's not something we've done in Concord in other places, unless you consider the football field something like that. But it's not
This is where, to
somebody
your
else who's
point,
going to buy it and build. It's something where we're doing a still having ownership and direction of the use.
and this is where, to your point, Pam, what I would encourage is us to use these 3 scenarios and the fact finding and costing that Carl and Carrie are doing, is that when we get into our integration, which is happening, I guess, this month and next month, we're going to get the risk analysis, find out what areas are, safe for various uses. We'll have this information. I would prefer to see it listed as a menu of, 10 or 20 items rather than the 3 scenarios. But then we can do mix and match and come up with not just 3 scenarios, but maybe 5 or 6 or 10 scenarios. What if a recreational facility was developed by a private entity acquiring the site and then doing a lease back? What if a recreational facility was done by the town acquiring the site and then we do a ground lease to an Edge Sports? I mean, we can look at all kinds of different scenarios that way. I realize they're all highly speculative, and that's why I think having more is kind of illustrative, that there's no certainty that any of these are going to happen, but we can play around once we have these numbers. And once we have, these 3 bounding scenarios, you would be able to do plug and play, mix and match your own scenario.
I was just saying that we don't have any evidence that anybody wants to buy this site and develop their own facility there. We have this idea that maybe that somebody like Edge might want to do a public-private partnership where they develop something that does town services or town-related services on town property.
Well, we
And
haven't
that's really a scenario 2, it's not we didn't find anybody that is my understanding.
we haven't spoken to them yet, so that's
Yeah, and best case on something like that is that between now and when we actually have to make our recommendations, they show some interest and they say, well, come back to us when the select board decides what to do. And then after that, then this is planning, in the planning period, then they sit down and figure out if there's a deal here to be struck. So, but this deal isn't going to be struck between now and the end of this year, that's for sure. So, so this is great. Let me just again, thank you guys. This is terrific. What is in this meeting packet, besides the slide deck, are a couple of pieces that should have made it into the previous meeting packets. And one is the summary, like, of Gary and Rich's interviews. And we've been talking about some of those, all the people that they've talked to. So this is probably worth looking at, if you haven't looked at it, and we can come back to this during the integration period or other meetings. That's in here. What's also in here is what Carl talked about during the last meeting, and we didn't have the final version, which is the grant and funding pieces. So just want to point to that information that's in the packet. So let me turn just briefly to the other work streams. I want to just briefly go to the other work streams, and I want to talk about what's going to happen over the next month and a half in terms of meetings. One particular thing we talked about at the last meeting, David, was sort of reaching out on the risk issues to individuals, and I know you were going to bring that up at the what's your kind of thinking on that right now, and on sort of outreach?
Once again, the idea was floated at the Conservation Coffee to resounding silence.
Yeah.
I even went out of my way to sit next to a couple of people who were identified previously as possibly really particularly avidly interested, and they weren't. So I think we're at the stage. I can continue those efforts with individuals in town, and I've asked a couple to tell me, can you suggest a person or two or three? I think the sense I have is that we're at a stage where people, it hasn't hit their radar screen enough for them to give a damn to want to have the conversation.
That may change after we kind of go public at a hearing.
Yes, it will. It will.
Yeah.
And we're building relationships now that are the foundations for those conversations later. You need to have two people who want to have the conversation. At the moment, I don't sense that there are a lot of people who do.
Okay. Any other work stream update? Well, let me preempt that a little bit by talking about the next few meetings. So I know you guys are sick of doodle polls, and I'm sick of doing them, but we have converged. If I didn't have gray hair, I'd have it now. April 25th at 5:45, we're going to have the meeting that we will vote to go into executive session on the legal issues. And I know that some of you are going to do that by Zoom, and some of you are going to do that in person. That time was set so that Mina could make it in person. I'd like him in person. So that's why that squirrely time at 5:45 was set up. He'll probably be there about that time, or at 6 p.m. So we'll have 10 or 15 minutes of non-legal business to deal with. And then, so that's what April 25th is, in case you're wondering. The risk briefing, which was originally going to be on the 25th, has now been bumped to May 28th. Our originally scheduled meeting on May 21st is moved to May 28th, and that's largely to accommodate our international traveler, Gary Kleiman, who needs to be at that meeting. But I think the timing is really good for a couple of reasons. I think Rue's report is not going to be drafted until June. I think Rue still needs to have a conversation with EPA to do sort of just a check on methodology. We haven't nailed down that date yet. But I think most importantly, that May 28th date precedes our two things. It precedes the public hearing that is scheduled for June 4th, and also precedes a possible briefing of the select board on June 10th. June 10th has not been confirmed yet because the new select board has to be reconfigured, and Mary Hardman who's the new chair of the select board, will have to get her schedule in order. But she has told me that she wants to have a briefing and that timing looks about right. So pencil in the 10th. So I think a lot of these important things that we all need to know on legal issues and risk issues, even though we haven't integrated all those yet, those perceive those two important briefings, one for the public and one for the select board. And we'll talk more about the content and framework for both those briefings at our next couple of meetings. So that's sort of an update on schedule. Any questions, concerns about?
A question on the public briefing. I thought you said June 4th, but the schedule you emailed says June 3rd, Monday, June 3rd for a possible public hearing. Did that switch?
It should be the 4th because, yeah, and I'm sorry, things got changed. I'm still straightening them out on the website. There seems to be no reason to have a public hearing on the 3rd than a meeting of the committee on the 4th. So we're gonna just do one and have a public hearing on the 4th. So there won't be any regular, that'll be in lieu of our regular meeting that week. Okay, so it's the 4th, cross off the 3rd, it's the 4th.
Paul, is there going to be any reading before I mean, I'd love to read some stuff if it's available before the legal executive session, or is there no way to distribute that? It has to be done in an executive session.
I think it has to be done in executive session. I think we work on a preliminary outline. Mina has come back and has an outline for that briefing. He prefers not to circulate that in writing
Okay.
beforehand, but it'll cover those general topics. As far as reading, I don't know, Pam and Court, there's so much that I've loaded into the meeting packets on sort of liability protection and et cetera. So I would read up on some of those EPA documents on how a town, a municipality affords themselves liability protections, because I think those are routes we're going to take. And that's public information. So some of that early information that's in the early meeting packets, I think to be a little bit more up to speed and conversant, it would be helpful to read those. I don't know, Pam and Court, if you have any other advice.
Well,
No,
I would-
I think that's right. I mean, there are basic documents from EPA that explain that, and I think you have one in the packets or from early on that covers our particular situation.
So I would only offer, if anybody wants, Pam, I hope I can speak for you too. If you want me and Pam to surface that again for you, so you don't have to wade through it, we'll do so. But I think you're right. It's the EPA documents that did spell out different acquisition methods without highlighting what was good, bad, or indifferent about them, and some of the related moves that an acquiring town might take to mitigate risk.
And also the title searches in there, and sort of the liens and mortgages are, that's something that's publicly available, something to read up on, because we'll discuss some of those, I'm sure, during our session, and the status of those. So other than that, I think doing both of those things would be helpful. Then, we're gonna listen to Mina and ask questions and get all up to speed on his thinking.
I was entertained when the Bridge published the value of all the properties in town, that 2229 was listed as worth $650,000.
Really, I'm not sure where that even came from.
I don't know on what that's based, but that was the number.
Probably
Really?
hello.
Yep.
The last time the assessors were able to get in there, right?
The confusion about who owns it and how the hell can you say what it's worth if you don't know its legal status? I don't know, but I laughed when I saw the number.
Well, I'm not sure it's worth anything as a Superfund site, but we'll see. We'll see. Okay. That's all I had for the agenda. Any other business before I ask for any public comment? Okay, a really good substantive discussion. So I'll open up, anybody have any public comments or questions? We'll take them now. Hearing none, last thing I'll say, I'm still thinking of writing an outline for the report. Sort of in the same time frame that we're starting to integrate things and thinking how to put these in writing. It's I think it's going to be important how we message and organize all of this. I mean, and today's discussion about the cost kind of underscore that, you know, because it can get quite interesting. We'll have to kind of lay that out, and we'll have to agree on how that's going to proceed. Okay. So our next meeting is on the 25th. It'll be the regular meeting, and we'll go into the executive session on that. It'll be the legal discussion, and that is coming up next Thursday, right? Yes, it is.
Correct.
Do you want a
Okay.
motion to adjourn?
No, I actually don't need a motion to adjourn, but I'll take one. I've learned I can just say we're adjourned.
Exactly.
And we are. Thank you very much. Really good meeting.
Night all.
Thank you.